In Africa, help is what we do. That is why we at FNB are relentlessly driven to provide real help to you, the passionate and courageous, the creators and the optimists. These are the entrepreneurs we support, the communities we uplift. It is because of you that real help is what we do. FNB, how can we help you?
Welcome back to First Issues. In previous episodes, we started conversations on the journey from going private to a public company, or in other words, a company listed on a stock exchange. Our discussions started with BSE CEO Thapelo Theole, who spoke on the TPD Mentorship Program, which is aimed at equipping potential issuers participating on the program practical training through comprehensive and interactive sessions that cover the key themes necessary to position a company to list on the BSE. We were also joined by General Manager Botswana Seedco International Limited, Samson Ruisi, who spoke on that journey. He said the biggest advantage to being listed, aside from having access to capital, is adhering to the best international business practices, which has been a very beneficial experience for their organization. In a follow-up episode, we were joined by Manu Makel, who's Senior Manager Corporate Finance at Deloitte & Touche, who spoke on the considerations that companies interested in going public need to make before listing. This evening, we close the series with a look at corporate governance and financial and integrated reporting. Joining us for these discussions are CEO at the Botswana Accountancy Oversight Authority, Duncan Majinda, and Head of Assurance at Grant Thornton, Ashwin Vaidyanathan. We start first with Duncan Majinda, who explains what role corporate governance plays on the journey to listing a company.
Corporate governance is very, very important in that corporate governance means the way companies are run, the way companies are managed. The success of an entity depends on the way it manages corporate governance. Issues like the constitution of the board, they are fundamentals of good corporate governance which relate to the constitution of the board, like executive and non-executive directors, like the balance of skills, knowledge, and expertise, like knowing the core function of the entity. It's all part of corporate governance. And then it translates into the performance of the entity in terms of profits. So the consequence of poor corporate governance is poor performance, without any shadow of doubt. I know of late we've had lots of problems with entities that it's all in the public. Yeah, what we have seen of late is that there is a lot about corporate governance that is in the public eye, where entities are not adopting good practices in corporate governance, and that translates in many problems of performance and stuff. My role here is to ensure that when entities go out and become public interest entities, then they are prepared for it. Because as soon as you list, then you become a public interest entity, and therefore you are publicly accountable. So the consequence of that is that you are going to get monies from people through the buying of shares. If you got problems in your company of corporate governance, then it will impact the performance of that company. So when you are moving, you are in that journey. It's more like, listing is the finals of the Olympics, for example. So you go to train yourself, fitness, dieting, and so that you can be ready for the listing. And the same thing with a company. If you want to go there, you go to train and make sure that your financial reporting is in order, your risk management is in order, your corporate governance is in order, so that when you get there, you just hit the ground running. So it's critical important for you to do that.
Ramajinda, what must the relevant stakeholders be cognizant of? This is in terms of the roles played, the composition of the roles, and the managerial hierarchy.
The composition of an entity or the oversight board is critical. You have to have the person running the show, that is the CEO or the managing director. And you have to have the chairman of the board. You can't combine those. So when you combine those, that means that spells the collapse of corporate governance straight away, because the chief executive can do whatever he wants to do. So there has to be a separation of the CEO and the chairman of the board. So we've got examples of entities in Botswana that combines the role, which is very, very bad. And then the board actually appoints the CEO, and then the CEO appoints management. So management will be dealing with all other issues like risk, like technology impact, auditing, internal and external. Those are the different roles that come in, and they are done by a management that is informed, that knows what it is doing. So with that knowledge of corporate governance, then that management will end up appointing the wrong people to the roles, and then risk management is not there, then there's a collapse. Technology awareness is not there, there's collapse. Legal knowledge is not there, then you might not know what's happening around you. So you've got to balance those players within the running of the entity.
In closing, what attention must be paid to the audit, to the risk, and the internal control remuneration should one have the thought to go public in mind?
First of all, audit is not a choice. It's a requirement of the Companies Act if you are a limited company. So audit actually entails you are actually giving assurance on the financial statements that have been issued by the entity. Assurance to the reader, to the shareholders. So it's a must. It's a must. Audit is a must. Internal audit is part of management controls. Internal audit is does not play the same role as an external auditor. If you are part of management, you're actually telling management that you are weak here, you are weak there, so correct here. Before the auditor, the external auditor comes. So it's clear, it's important that you know the difference between internal auditor and external auditor. And then the internal auditor will concentrate more on internal controls, although he looks at a whole systems of control that are within the company, but the internal controls are key, and he actually ensures that the internal controls are there to protect the assets of the entity. And risk is important. The reason why risk is important is that when you do something, you got to know the consequences of it. It's important again to note the risk-return trade-off. So where there is low risk, normally the returns are low. So when there is high risk, normally everything being equal, the returns are high. So it's important for you to know the risk that is there, and then see how you can identify the risk and come up with risk responses that you can do, or even take opportunities. So that's why risk is so critical. The effectiveness of a risk entity is to ensure that it looks at the risk that can lead to effective, that I can call effective running of the entity and resulting in high returns, and the risk that can actually collapse you. So it's important for you to distinguish through that. The internal control are designed by management to control virtually everything in an entity, to control the preparation of financial statements. And then because of that, normally management then appoints the internal auditor to do work on their behalf. And again, we are careful that if we are looking at the board, you have to ensure that although the management appoints the internal auditor, is doing that on behalf of the audit committee, which is part of the board. So the board is like appointing the internal auditor and say, can you check the controls within within the entity and report to us. And then we can take corrective action. So you see, it's a management tool that's linked to the board through a committee of the board, which is the audit committee. So that's critical to have that distinction. So an audit committee that reports directly to management we don't accept that. It has to report to the board or board committee called audit committee.
In Africa, help is what we do. That is why we at FNB are relentlessly driven to provide real help to you, the passionate and courageous, the creators and the optimists. These are the entrepreneurs we support, the communities we uplift. It is because of you that real help is what we do. FNB, how can we help you?
In closing, the journey to listing a company does not start on the day an IPO is announced, but rather months or even years prior. Some preparations may include financial and integrated reporting. To talk further on this, we have Ashwin Vaidyanathan, who's Head of Assurance at Grant Thornton.
Financial reporting is primarily an entity to comply with the reporting framework they have adopted. So when we say as reporting framework, what we mean is in Botswana, you are expected to adopt international financial reporting standards. And if you're not a large entity, you can adopt international financial reporting standards for small and medium business. And if you're a very small micro entity, you also have the Botswana gap to adopt. So as long as you've adopted these frameworks and you comply your financial statements in line with these frameworks, you will be required to present certain statements, which would be the statement of financial position, statement of comprehensive income, which shows your profit or loss, statement of changes in equity, which shows the shareholders' funds, and the statement of cash flow. And these are accompanied with policies of how these numbers have come through into the financials and the notes, which are more detailed to what is being presented in these 4 statements. When you combine all of this, these are called the financial statements, and the whole set, including the notes, is called a set of financial statements for a particular period.
We sometimes hear in the corporate spaces of integrated reporting. Perhaps you could explain to us what it is and how it differs from financial reporting.
Corporates, like listed companies, used to just only present the financial statements to their shareholders. And over time, there were a lot of questions which were being asked, for which answers were not given to the shareholders. So eventually the reporting framework started coming up with corporate governance requirements. And this report came as the King 3 report, which defined various aspects of an annual report a company needs to submit. In that, they started telling how the company manages its risk, how they produce things, what is their corporate social responsibility, what is the financial responsibility, how do they manage the human capital. A lot more information started coming out. The size of annual reports started getting big because each company was interested in telling their story to their shareholders, to their stakeholders, to the banks, to the creditors, to everybody, to say, we are doing such great things. Please know what we are doing, not just the numbers. Okay. That has evolved further to say integrated reporting. There are 7 points to be adhered to on integrated reporting. That basically cohesively says what happens in an organization. Not only what they do, but what they do to the environment, what they do to the community, what they do to their people, what do they do to their stakeholders, how do they manage themselves from the risk of not going out of business. The whole story is packaged and presented to the shareholder. That's what we call as integrated reporting. It's not just numbers anymore. It goes beyond numbers to say what you believe in, what you implement, and what is the benefit to everybody, including the environment, from your operations. And that is what constitutes integrated reporting. If I have to go in detail, it's a very big subject. But in crux, it's primarily to report about everything of what you believe as a company and how you have operated for the last 1 year and telling your story.
This program was brought to you in association with First National Bank of Botswana.
FNB, how can we help you?